And I think good writing is like a good joke. If you explain the joke, then it's not funny anymore, you know? And the same thing with writing. Sometimes I read books and it's going so well, they're trying to do this thing. And then at the end, they try to explain it. And I'm like, no, you should have just left it there, you know? Let the reader work.
I'm Nathan Maharaj, and this is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is the writer and filmmaker Jamaluddin Aram, winner of the 2024 Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer Prize for Literary Fiction for his novel Nothing Good Happens in Wazirabad on Wednesday. It's a tapestry of stories about different people, shopkeepers, tradespeople, doctors, children, and their parents, while in the background, often very deep in the background, a war is being fought. Jamal, welcome to Kobo.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it is absolutely my pleasure. Why set the story in this place?
Well, that's the neighborhood that I grew up. And I think it's interesting that nobody has heard of that place. It's right right next to, actually, to the Kabul International Airport. And also, it's in between Kabul International Airport and this neighborhood where all the diplomats live and work, where the U.S. Embassy and all the European embassies were there. Given the fact that how much money poured into the country in those 20 years and how many diplomats and people and travelers traveled to that country, getting off at Kabul International Airport and going to all over the country, but never knowing the name of this little neighborhood they drove right past it. And so that was one of the reasons. And the other reason that I said the story there is that, as you mentioned, it's a tapestry of stories, but it's also a tapestry of people. Afghanistan is one of those countries that we are blessed and cursed to be so ethnically diverse. And Wazirabad was one of those places where you had people from all different ethnic groups. And it was, a place to set the story and, in a way, say that we can coexist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a line halfway through this book that goes, in Wazirabad, there was talk about everyone, as though one had to exist in the town's gossip to be real. It's a beautiful line. It's so evocative. It also would have been a really great opening line. But as I say, it shows up halfway through. The way the book actually starts is with a boy carefully, tenderly, patiently embedding glass shards in clay at the top of a wall to keep burglars out. So can you speak a bit about the pieces of this book and how you to carry on with our metaphor, how you wove this tapestry?
It was challenging, but something that I like about writing, you probably know that writing, people keep saying writing is difficult, and there's some truth to that. It's a difficult thing to do because you start to create this world that didn't exist before, and you're creating it, you're filling it with people, with places, with sins, and if you don't find a way to enjoy what you're doing, the hardship of writing will soon defeat you. You'll just give up. So for me, one of the challenges is writing in English itself, because English is not my first language. It's Farsi. And then along the way, I create other challenges for myself while overcoming those challenges, you get work done, you get writing done. And one of that was, how do you, in each chapter, it's about one person or one family's story, and then there are other characters show up in this chapter. When you move on through the book, then you get to see this one character that showed up in one sentence or one scene in this chapter, they have their own chapter. But there are other characters who show up in them. It's almost like I used to, when I was growing up during the 90s, we used to weave carpet. And now that I look back at it, and also at the structure of the book, it's almost like weaving carpet. You bring all these patterns and colors, and you carry it out throughout the book, and you have to make sure that everything fits like parts of a puzzle.
When you were writing these sections that focused on one pocket, one cluster of characters with their concerns and their lives, did you know beforehand which of these characters would bridge into everywhere else? Did you know what needed to follow or needed to come up at some point elsewhere in the book?
No, it was everything while I was writing, and I think that's one of the good things about writing without planning out, mapping out the book. Well, probably in the future I would do that, but for this one, I would be working on one scene, and then I was like, oh, it would be so interesting to bring that character into the story here because of this thing that this person is saying or referring to something or the weather. And the moment that you realize that piece, that, oh, that character would show up here and would be beautiful, it's such a beautiful feeling. And I think that's why writers write, to arrive at that precise moment that a name, a sound, rain falling or snow falling or somebody's knocking on the door, and that little piece like brings everything together, and you're like, you feel as if you've solved the world's greatest mystery.
Oh, I'm frankly stunned and awed by the idea that this book evolved so that it grew out of you so organically, that it really was just following your whims. I wondered, did it bear any resemblance to documentary filmmaking?
In a way it did. Well, I want to mention something else. When I started writing out this book, I didn't intend for it to be a novel. And of course, when you read it, it doesn't have the structure of a conventional novel, right? It's a collection of stories that are interconnected. Mm-hmm. And that is how I started writing it, a collection of interconnected stories. And it was later on in the edit process that we decided to turn it into a novel. And of course, that also presented its own challenges of how do you bring this book of interconnected stories and give it the attributes of a novel, which was another interesting puzzle to work, to solve, to bring those bridges that connect the stories, make it stronger. And in terms of does it resemble documentary filmmaking, I think it does. The documentary school that I was trained in, it's called Cinema Verite. It's a French filmmaking style, documentary filmmaking style, in which you don't interfere with the characters. You can't tell them, okay, can you drink another sip of water because I couldn't take the previous shot, right? You are just there with your camera and you observe everything. You don't tell people what to do and what not to do. And you just record life, basically, and people who are going about their lives. And that is, in a way, that's how this book is done. You just see people doing very mundane things, talk about things that are not in the news anymore, or people don't care, but people of that town care about it because their life, how they connect to each other, relies on those little bits and pieces.
The look in your eye, as you described, like making the new problems for yourself. I hesitate to ask this question, but was there a favorite piece to write about? Was there a favorite character or family to follow?
I worked on that book for a long time, probably over 6 years. But the last, after I finished the first draft, and I was working with my editor, and she says, there's this character, the widow, in the book. And before that, in the earlier drafts, you would only hear her name.
Yeah.
And how people talked about her. She was a very integral part of the story, but you wouldn't directly or be close to her to see how she lived. And my editor said it would be nice if you somehow write about her so that we can get to see what her life is about and look like. And then I went back, and that is another puzzle. So you're writing this new character, or that you have people have heard all these things about, all rumors, some of which are not true, and then now you're writing about her, and you have to somehow address all these other rumors that people talked about.
You're in the gossip.
Say, yeah, like, are these things true? Does that fit with the character that people are reading about? And that was interesting, because once you add something or remove something, and because it's so closely knit, and there's so many people in this story, in this book, is that you remove one thing or add one thing, and then you say, oh, now I have to add like something along the lines of what I did here to that person's story, because this changes that. And then you have to do that throughout the book. I remember when my editor and my agent, we had a Zoom conversation, we talked about it, and I said, I was full of ideas that day. I said all these things, and then when I went back to writing, and I'm like, why did I say those things? This is so hard.
When you identified that you had made a problem for yourself, when you began deciding what was true and what was false, what was the interior life of the widow, those problems you described, were they always the mechanics of plot, or was it emotional tone and texture and trying to mirror and contrast?
I think it was a bit of all, because for me, truth telling is one of the most important things in writing. Of course, besides enjoying the writing itself, to tell the truth. And sometimes the truth is very hard to hear. For example, when you hear all these things about people talking about the widow and that she is sleeping with strange men who show up at all hours, and then you probably have this idea of, oh, she's a loose woman. But then when you go into that chapter that I write about her, you actually see why she started on this life. How did she, because she comes from the countryside, how did she end up in Kabul, in the capital? And why did she start, selling herself? Why did she do that? And then when you go deeper into that, you see that she's not selfish. She's doing this because to help herself and also her mother-in-law, who's elderly, and she has lost her son, which is Husnia, the widow's husband, to the war. And when you go into all those little details, all of a sudden it makes sense what she does, because she has no other skill. She's from the countryside, and she suddenly found herself in the city, and there's a war. What else could she do?
Mm. There are a few characters that we don't actually get much interiority from. As the tapestry is woven, some kind of get left to the side. And I'm thinking specifically, there are these young militiamen in the town, and they're kind of the presence of this war. We know from context that they're sons and brothers. They're part of this community. They're not alien to this. We don't really get inside their minds. Was it your plan to keep them at arm's length?
I think one of the reasons that I did was, initially when I started writing the book, was that, for example, the war.
Mm-hmm.
I don't talk about the war or dedicate any of the chapters to the horrors of the war. It is in the background. And one of the reasons I did that was that every time you type Afghanistan or you hear on the news anything, people who have gone from outside, journalists and reporters to Afghanistan, they reported on the war. Mm-hmm. There has been so much written about the war. And so my goal was, in a way, to not talk about things that have already occupied so much space, but to pay attention and write about things that hasn't had that kind of, space and coverage, about peace, about mundane things. And the same thing about characters. The militias are everywhere. They have no one to answer to. They write their own stories. They can do whatever they want to. And then there are other people who cannot do anything they want to. They are responding to the curveballs that life has been, throwing at them. For example, Sima, the little girl, or Aziz, her brother, the same way, the widow. These are the people, I don't like to use the marginalized term here, but people who haven't had the chance to tell their stories, to occupy the center stage. And that, in a way, in that book, I tried to put them the center stage to tell their stories.
Mm-hmm. When we focus on one of these characters, Seema, who you mentioned, she's a young woman. She's studying calligraphy. She says early on, the first lesson she learned without knowing, she doesn't say this, sorry, the narration of her section says, the first lesson she learned without knowing was that the war wasn't as bad as people had said it would be. It could get ugly and unbelievably enormous at times, but it wouldn't be big enough to alter the order of things or stop her from having nightmares. By this point in the book, the reader has seen some gunfire. The physical presence and threat of the war has shown itself, and we do have some awareness of real human lives being lost. But what we don't get, and I think it touches on what you said about all that's already been said and what you didn't need to add your voice to the chorus of, is this isn't a book about characters living in dread. There's not that sensibility of looming danger. We appreciate it's there, but it's almost like the weather. Was that, I guess, the looming dread thing feels like a trap one could fall into as a writer? Were you conscious of that?
Yes, because I lived through that time period, and there were moments, I think I've mentioned in the book, there were moments that there is war, there is, rockets launched on the neighborhood that you're living, and it is hard. You could not, be alive the next minute, because you don't know if one of those rockets launched, blind rockets, would land on the place, on the house that you're living. But they cannot launch rockets for forever. There are breaks in that fighting, and when there is a break, kids like to play. It doesn't matter if there is not enough food, but they would like to play, and then they go outside, or even when they are inside the house trapped, they play in their imagination. And I think that is so necessary, because if there is any way that we can get out of wars, is that kind of life that imposes itself on the war, on us, on everything. Because without it, how can we go on? And so that was the goal, to kind of write about things that gets lost. For example, when you read about Afghanistan or the history of Afghanistan, people who haven't lived there, they think, do these people even know what peace is? Do they even know what laughter is? Because, or a good meal, because there's always poverty and hunger and war. And my goal, in a way, writing this book, was to, let me show you, let's break it down to the slowest moment in this neighborhood. There's nothing going on, and there are two people just sitting there. Like, for example, one good example is the bone sitter and the elderly woman. And, they're just sitting there and chatting, and there's a cat in that room, and there's the smell of spices and herbs and everything. And the old lady has her own issues and things that troubles her, and the bone sitter has her own issues, but they're sitting there human to human, they just chat. And what is most important than that?
Mm-hmm. There's a scene where a character named Gul Muhammad, he's trimming the fingernails of his father, who is known colloquially as the Mule. There are other things going on in this scene too, but I bring it up because I remember reading the first couple pages a couple of times to get my bearings. I needed some help determining that the mule was in fact dead. That the senior of the family had passed, and that in fact what I was observing was his son performing a ritual of grooming of his father's body. If not for the title, which is What They Do to Their Dead, I may still be reading that chapter in a loop right now, not being sure where in the metaphysical plane we are. The reason I bring it up, though, is because it made me wonder about how you conceived of readers for this book, for whom I imagine there's a substantial audience who would recognize right away what was going on, with or without the clue of the chapter title. How were you thinking of readership, or were you thinking of readership at all?
Actually, I don't know if it's right to say, but I wasn't. I was just, that was a problem for me to solve, and I was trying to solve it for myself to see if it makes sense. And I think good writing is like a good joke. If you explain the joke, then it's not funny anymore, you know? And the same thing with writing. Sometimes I read books and it's going so well, they're trying to do this thing, and then at the end they try to explain it. I'm like, no, you should have just left it there, you know? Let the reader kind of work. I think it's what makes writing and reading interesting is that books ask active participation from the reader. And that is the active participation that you read. You try to figure out what is going on here, right? If you don't do that, then there's no point in reading. It's not activating your imagination. And that was what I was trying to do, was to just write and try to make it concrete, make it solid, so that it makes sense. But if it asks the reader to read it once or twice, then, you know,
it's still time well spent.
Yeah.
That truly is my favorite kind of book too, because it's that sense of a writer who is committing to their own mind on the page, and not troubling to serve a bunch of other minds, because then that diffuses the effect. And one of the other sort of artifacts of your approach, I think, is that there are occasional phrases, I assume in Farsi, I don't speak Farsi, but there are phrases that you leave untranslated. And if we speak Farsi, that's great, then we've understood. If we don't, we're going to have to figure it out just we're just going to have to keep reading. We're going to have to read nice and close and figure out what the emotional ripples are from what the person said. And I really enjoyed that. That was on the level of, if Tolkien could leave Elvish untranslated, we can handle the Farsi phrase on the page.
Yeah, I think it was also, that's kind of the playfulness of, I tried to be playful to make writing interesting. That was one of those parts of being playful, is that, of course, I'm writing about Afghanistan. I'm writing about this particular neighborhood, and I leave things for people who only speak Farsi. They read it and they say, oh, yeah, I recognize that, you know? And also, if I'm not translating it literally, but I'm trying to work it in the context of that scene, of that sentence, so that even if you don't read that Farsi part, if you can read it for, the music of it, but even if you don't read that Farsi part, it is somewhere that meaning is communicated in the text, in that scene or in that sentence, either the sentence before or the sentence after. For example, if somebody says a sentence in Farsi, and then the other person responds, and that the response is in English, so that you can get from the answer what the question was. It's of course, you're also running a risk, because if people don't have that kind of patience and time and dedication to actively participate in the act of reading, then you will lose them. But for serious readers, then that's a lot of fun to do. And I think that's who I'm writing for. People who enjoy reading as much as I enjoy writing it. And then making all those little details there, it's worth it for people who understand and they enjoy that kind of, playfulness. So that's what I've been trying to do with that book and with every piece of writing.
Speaking of playfulness, I understand you're an admirer of the Argentinian poet and short story writer Jorge Luis Borges, as well as the Italian writer Italo Calvino. Can you speak about what you feel you've learned from these writers, or things that you seek maybe to emulate sometimes?
I think from Calvino, actually both of them were stylists, and both of them were intellectuals and thinkers. And I think sometimes, for example, let's take the example of Afghanistan because we are talking about this book and that country. You go in there, and if you don't know the country, you go in there and you want to write something about, you will write about something that is right in front of you, and it's the war. It's enormous. It has all the gore and the excitement that you can write, and people will relate to, or at least understand, or would like to read. And then there are a lot of things that you don't see. But people like Borges and Calvino, they saw everything, The fact that I'm wearing this jacket today, I was reading something by Borges yesterday, an essay, and he was talking about, the essay is called Blindness, and he's talking about how he lost his sight. And he brings attention to something that you never thought about, your sight, your vision. We go to sleep, we wake up, we take our vision for granted. But then you read Borges and you say, no, you cannot take this thing for granted. The fact that, for example, Borges in that essay mentions that the two colors that he could see, because he was totally blind in one eye and the other one was probably 80% blind. But the two colors that he could see, one was blue and another one was yellow. Yellow he could see more than blue. And then he has this paragraph or this sentence where he talks about how he cannot see the color red anymore. And I'm just reading that and I'm like, this is such a blessing to be able to see the color red, And who else, what other writer brings your attention to something that you never thought about? You probably see red everywhere and you don't even register. It's just a color. Yeah. But then you read great writers like them. And then you say, oh, every little detail in this world, we are so blessed to be able to see them, to taste them, to smell them, And that's what I like about them. Of course, the power and their understanding of the language.
I was struck to discover that Borges was an influence initially, because I think the impression a lot of readers have of a writer like him and Calvino is their playfulness with form. That there's always, with Borges, there's always a premise. This is the library where every book is 410 pages and there's 22 characters in the alphabet, or we're in a garden of forking paths, or what have you. That was my first thought. My second thought was, no, that totally tracks. I think what we miss often with writers who do play with form is we miss, when they're truly masterful, that they're still writing about people, and that the premise matters because there's people in it, and it's about how people act within this framework. I guess is there a puzzling, convoluted premise, story or novel you're working on, or really has it always just been the people in their work that have struck you?
I think, as you mentioned rightly so, at the core of everything that we do, whether that is poetry, whether that is stories and prose, we are dealing with people. And I don't know anyone who has written anything about any abstract object and it would be gripping, Even if you are writing about something abstract, you're looking at that thing through a human's perspective, or even a living thing, a dog's perspective, for example. You're bringing back to something that is living, right? And how we connect to that. So for me, I write about people, and I write about a certain type of people, as I mentioned earlier, people who haven't had the chance to occupy space, to tell their stories, because it was always, there were other stories that were deemed more important, and took preference over their stories. So I write about those people, and that is such a universal theme to write about. For example, the topic of, you dislocate your shoulder. Anybody can relate to that, and the pain, and at least understand the kind of pain that the person is going through. And once that happens, you have to find a way to fix it. Do you go to a doctor? Do you go to a hospital? If there's none of those, you should go to a bone sitter, And for example, people falling in love, even if that love is just unrequited and one-sided, there's this little kid who's, in love with this woman who's a widow, and there's an age difference, and he's admiring her from a distance. All of these things are human stories, and it's important to be told, rather than, oh, there was war, I don't know, 100 people died, or we have heard those a lot, and we have to write about things that are beautiful, that gives us as hope to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
We mentioned the style and the form. I think one of the chapters in the book that I really like, and my editor liked it, and the people who are serious readers, they liked it, was the chapter where there's the dream going on, and somebody gets the electrician.
Yeah.
And I had so much fun writing that, because you are in this space where you don't know if this is a dream or if this is reality, right?
Yeah.
And writing it was challenging to kind of balance that dream world with the real world. And also, I personally think I might be, because I wrote it, I think that is the best writing in the whole book, that chapter, the way the language flows, the way the characters came in and out and into the story, into the narrative, and also the weather and all these characters, all these rumors and gossips. I think if you take certain parts of the story of the book, and you say, oh, this is about gossip, this is about a community, this is about people doing strange things, this is about dreams, this is about war, this is about peace. And then in that chapter, all of that comes together, and it's woven in strange ways. And of course, because they are smoking hash while waiting for the electrician to come out, so that you have that kind of, are they hallucinating, or is this real life happening? And I think, and my editors think, that's the best part of the book. And then you hear from some readers, and they say, oh, I did not know what was going on. And specifically, they mentioned that chapter. I'm like, you didn't get the whole point of the story. That is the story. That is, if it's hard, you can read it once or twice. I think it was Faulkner, somebody said that they didn't understand The Sound and Fury, his book, and they said, we read it twice and we didn't read it, we didn't understand it. And Faulkner said, well, read it again. Yeah. That's the risk you're running with playing with style, with form, is that sometimes for the readers who just want to read something simple and easy, then they get to that point of the book and you say, what's this?
Yeah. Well, I think the risk is what is literary fiction? It's like impossible to define, but I think it's fiction that takes that risk. It goes to a place that it's not going to work for some readers. It may work for no readers, but we can still see that somebody they tried something, and they weren't trying to please a broad readership. They're trying to do something on the page that was really about how do we understand each other? How do words convey anything to anybody, and what do they do in our brains?
Yeah, you're right, and it's also, I think it's a kind of, if we think about it really, it's a reflection of our reality. Yeah. Sometimes you see things in real life that you say, I couldn't even dream about this thing in my wildest dreams, and I'm seeing it unfold right in front of my eyes. Some events, for example, you just take the example of Afghanistan 3 years ago.
Mhm.
This whole war came to nothing. They just went back to where it had started, you know? And then you sit and you think to yourself, how did this happen? Is this a nightmare or is this reality? Where did all these 20 years go? How many lives were lost on all sides? What about, their lives? What about the price of their blood? Why did we do this why did we go through this whole thing? If somebody wrote about that and it didn't happen in reality, if somebody wrote about that, that would probably even work for a science fiction book. But it's happening in reality in front of our eyes, and we are still shocked to believe it. Sometimes literature, or most times, it's just a reflection of our reality, and sometimes people are in their heads and they can think anything that they want to, and then if you just put that on the page, then you can. That chapter in that book is a refined form of that kind of chaos and beautiful chaos that life can be.
I think maybe if there's a nod that you make to playing with form or some postmodern, whatever we might call it, maybe it's Dr. Jamal, the doctor who. Well, he's there, isn't he? Can you tell us about this character, your namesake?
Yes, actually, the person, I just changed the name. When we were growing up, there was this doctor, which I learned, years later, that he wasn't a doctor. He used to work at the Ministry of Health, and I think he was at the procurement department somewhere. And then he would bring medicine, injections, and pills from his work, which was in a way, illegal. He would steal and he would bring them, and he had this little room in his house where people would go to get injections and get pills and whatnot. And Dr. Jamal he actually had some knowledge of some basic, like if you have a headache, if you have sore throat, what should be done. So he had that kind of basic knowledge, and I think people went to him for the placebo effect rather than more than anything else, and he was there. So Dr. Jamal's character is kind of drawn from that person that my mom took me a couple of times when I was running a fever and needed some pills. Yeah.
Was there any impulse at any point to give him somebody's name other than your own for the reader to laugh at?
I don't know. I think that just came up. It just fit. There was actually another Dr. Jamal, but he wasn't prescribing medications or given injections. So I think I kind of merged those two people, the guy who did the injection and the pills, and the guy whose name people said Dr. Jamal, but he wasn't. He worked at a hospital, but not in any capacity to treat people. So I think I took that person's name and put it on this.
Okay. Not a namesake after all. Okay, so much for my investigative work. I'll go back to just talking about books.
It's interesting that in our extended family there are 5 Jamals, including me. So and then there are a couple of other Jamals in the neighborhood. So you have like 7, 8, 10 Jamals in the same neighborhood. Different ages, different families.
There's a line that I love. The Bone Setter, when he says, "Be open to miracles, but also go see a doctor."
Yeah, that's very true, I think.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a. I mean, that's tattoo worthy. That's that's a good one. I wanted to come back around and ask about your writing process, because, as you said, English is not your first language, yet you've won not just one award for writing in it. Tell me about your process, though, because I understand there is a multi-step process you go through with writing, with drafts. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yes, I mentioned that playfulness and the fact that you have to have something to work toward, to work through the hardship that is that is writing. And for me, that thing is, of course, one, writing in a language that I'm not very familiar with and I'm trying to be good at. And also the other thing is, how do you communicate a feeling or an idea? Because I think everything that you can say or want to say, it has already been said. If it's somebody's going through breakup or divorce or like physical pain, emotional pain, people having hope, people who are in despair, all of that has been already said. How are you going to say it, right? So I think in terms of the freshness of the language, that's what it comes down to. You pair one verb with a noun, or move parts of a sentence around, and all of a sudden you're saying the same old thing but in a new way. And I think that is the job of poets and writers, because without such kind of invention, our language over time will grow very, blunt and uninteresting. So that is what I try to do, and I get a lot of joy from doing that. When I can craft a sentence that sounds nice, you read it and you say, oh, there's a cadence to it, and all of a sudden there's a blush of color in the middle of that sentence, whether that is the color of paprika, or the color of a flower, or the color of sky or dust. And then there's scents. I try to play with anything that I can find around me, from weather, from spices, food, music, sounds, anything. So, and when it's almost like I feel I'm a kid and I'm just playing, and I'm not even thinking about, oh, how is this going to turn out? And then once that play phase is over, then you have written something, and then you say, okay, does this make sense? And then that's when in the edit process, you just tweak it and take things out that is too much, or it doesn't make sense, or makes the sentence too heavy. And then, even then, it's playing. You just take things out and put things back in. And that is the process. I think you mentioned earlier if I had any specific reader in mind when I was writing it. No, it's just me, trying to come up with a good sentence.
Is that play with story? Where does that come from? Has that been with you? Like, is that the kind of kid you were? Is that more of a family thing of like sitting around the table and challenging one another to be the entertainment?
I think it's quite the opposite. Our family, we of course had as children, there's no way you cannot be playful, because that's part of your nature. That's how you grow, right? But given the fact that the time I was growing up in the 90s, the Civil War, the Taliban, the poverty, and all of that, so I didn't have that kind of a childhood where you have time to play, right? So because, as I mentioned earlier, weaving carpet, I think I was 8 or 9 or even younger when my brother and I started weaving carpet. It was just to help my parents, with expenses. There was no economy. This was in the 90s. There was the Taliban. So weaving carpet was, in a way, our contribution for the food that we were eating. So a lot of that time was spent working instead of playing. And I'm so fortunate, so grateful that in this stage of my life, I have a chance to be a kid again and to play, but this time with words.
I really love this book. I'm so glad you came by to talk about it. Thank you so much, Jamal.
Thank you very much for having me here.
I have been speaking with Jamaluddin Aram, author of the novel that won the 2024 Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer Prize for Literary Fiction, Nothing Good Happens in Wazirabad on Wednesday. Find it and the other winners at kobo.com/emerging writer prize. There is a link in the show notes to make it easy. Subscribe in your podcast player to catch every episode. And if you enjoyed this one, which I think was great, even if it did originally come out on a Wednesday, tell somebody. Kobo in Conversation is produced and hosted this time around by me, Nathan Maharaj. Thank you for listening.